Welcome, everyone. It's so good to be back with you guys this afternoon as we get ready to finish the new content, the end of the AP World History course. Today is going to be our last day of addressing new content. And for the rest of April, we're going to be focused on reviewing for the AP World History test. A quick reminder, if you haven't had the opportunity yet, you can go back and listen to Friday's live stream. On Friday's live stream, you'll find a whole bunch. As a matter of fact, all of the available information about the AP World History test. And on Monday, yesterday, Mr. Logero went over that information one more time. So I'm not going to go over the rubric today or the testing procedures or the security measures, but if you haven't had the opportunity to go over that information, I strongly advise you to go back and look at the previous two live stream lessons and take some really thorough notes so that you understand exactly what the AP World History test is going to look like. Just a reminder, we've been doing this together for a long time now, but I am Chad Smith and I work at MacArthur High School. I'm proud to be a MacArthur Cardinal, and we live and work in the North Dallas area of Texas. So let's get into, before we get into our AP World History Modern lesson today, let's take a moment and talk a little bit about our review lesson, our activity from the end of the day yesterday. Mr. Logero gave us this document that was describing religious activities in Japan in the 20th century. And he gave us 3 questions to respond to incorporate the document and respond to. So the first question asks you to understand the concept of religious syncretism. Religious syncretism is when, because of migration or movement, often as a result of trade, 2 religious concepts mix together, and out of that mixing, a new religious concept is created. So what we have to do is we have to find evidence of people practicing combined religious practices in this text. Here are 3 possible examples, but please remember these are not the only possible correct answers. One possible correct answer is the mixing of Shinto and Buddhist religious beliefs illustrates the process of religious syncretism. Buddhism is a religion that originally was created in South Asia or India, and over the course of the Silk Roads traveled and became very popular in China. But through Japanese actively seeking out Chinese cultural influence, Buddhism also became popular in Japan. Shintoism, however, was a native Japanese religious belief. And so the combined elements of Shintoism and Buddhism are examples. A more specific answer would be to say the reading of the Buddhist sutras before the shrines of the Shinto kami. That is a more specific way of answering the question. Another potential answer here is that the association of Shinto kami as a Buddhist bodhisattva in Japanese religion shows the process of religious syncretism. Just a reminder, if you forgot what a bodhisattva is, bodhisattvas are a part of the way that Buddhism changed over time, especially as it traveled along the Silk Roads with merchants and became very popular in China during a time of political chaos. The idea of the bodhisattva is that an individual would achieve enlightenment or perfection, and they would be able to free themselves from the cycle of reincarnation. However, they would choose to remain living on Earth as a personal sacrifice in order to help other individuals toward the end of reincarnation, toward freedom from that cycle, known in Buddhism as nirvana. The next question asks you to think of one other example of religious syncretism in a region somewhere else other than Japan. Now, this is an extremely important theme throughout AP World History Modern. Over and over and over again, as people move, as they migrate to new places, as they're forced to migrate to new places, as they travel as a result of trade, And sometimes they pick new homes as a result of establishing merchant communities. Religions mix together, and those mixes of religions establish new religious concepts. One example would be Chinese Buddhism, which contains element of Taoism, and Confucianism, which are both native to China. Well, as we said before, Buddhism is native to South Asia or India. Another example would be the blending of shamanist and Buddhist beliefs in Korea. The shamanist beliefs were often native in Korea, and Buddhism traveled to Korea as a result of the tribute system from China. A third potential example is Gnosticism, which combines elements of Judaism with Christianity and pagan Greco-Roman beliefs. One of the most commonly recognized examples is Sikhism. Sikhism was developed in India during the Mughal rule. Remember, the Mughal Empire is a time in Indian history where Muslims, a minority Muslim group, ruled over the majority Hindu people. And some Mughal leaders operated under the idea of extreme religious tolerance, while other Mughal leaders operated under the concept of religious persecution. But during a time of extreme religious tolerance, there was a new religion created called Sikhism, which combined both Hindu and Islamic principles. Vodun, Santeria, and Candomblé are all syncretic religious ideas that happened as a result of Africans being kidnapped and forced to move to the Americas. Oftentimes, the forced conversions of Catholics and Christian missionaries over indigenous American peoples, and the blending of indigenous American cultures with European cultures and African cultures led to the development of new religious belief systems. Another example happened in modern-day Iran, often referred to as Persia or the Middle East, a part of the Middle East. The Baha'i religion that originated there shows elements of many of the world religions from that territory. Okay, one more question here. This one is about understanding the context of the passage. It says, explain one global process after 1980 that contributed to historians' increased interest in studying the type of cross-cultural interactions. Well, we've talked a lot over the last several days about what could have happened after 1980 that brought people of different cultures together. Here are some potential answers. Historians became more interested in studying religious syncretism because of increased globalization and the resulting fundamentalist reaction to Westernization. The growing popularity of Asian religious practices in the West has increased Western historians' interest in religious syncretism. Historians became increasingly interested in studying syncretism after the emergence of social movements that challenged traditional religious teachings about gender and social hierarchy. And finally, religious conflicts in multi-confessional regions, such as Bosnia, increased historians' interest in religious syncretism as they tried to understand how different religious groups interacted and influenced with one another. Now, before we move on to our own activity today, I want to remind you that you absolutely could have correct answers that we didn't put on the screen. And so I encourage you all to reach out to your own AP World History teacher and discuss these concepts with them, especially questions B and C. Now, real quickly, I want to remind you that while you're not necessarily going to be you're not going to be answering a short answer question on the test, each of those questions did have the opportunity to test you on specific skills that you're going to need to write a DBQ. The first question asked you to find specific evidence inside the document. That's a skill you have to do. As a matter of fact, on the DBQ, you can earn 2 out of 10 points for successfully achieving that skill. The second question asked you to think up evidence that supported an argument. That's evidence outside the document. And you can do that twice on your DBQ, you'll earn 2 points. Finally, the third question asks you to consider the ideas and the topics of the document in global context. And that's worth 1 point on the DBQ. So if you got all 3 of those questions right, then you successfully achieved 3 skills that can earn you up to 5 out of 10 points on your DBQ. Let's get into an activity today. Yesterday, Mr. Logereau talked to you a little bit about the ideas of context and what does it mean for us to have historical context. I'm going to give you 2 minutes and I want you to read this document, which is the Preamble to the United Nations Charter in 1945. After you've read it, I want you to jot down in your notes some potential answers to the question, describe historical context for this document. Go ahead. Take another minute to read the document and think about and jot down ideas for the historical context. Okay, so hopefully you had some time to think about what was happening in the world when this document was written in 1945. But the document itself also gives you a little bit of a hint right there in the first couple of lines when it says to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind. The best answer to providing historical context for this document, the preamble to the United Nations Charter, is the end of World War II. The idea that not just the end of World War II, but the idea that both world wars led to nearly 50 years of global conflict, and that the countries that were involved in these global conflict, even the winners, suffered extraordinary losses in life and economic losses as well. And so the idea that these wars might have been prevented, that these, or at least ostensibly, that these wars might have been prevented, this all serves as context for better understanding why a document like this might be created in the first place. All right, I'm going to give you just about a minute, maybe 90 seconds this time, and I want you to read the document again. But this time, I want you to read the document with a totally different purpose. This time, I want you to read the document considering what causes did the people in the charter have? What causes did they have for creating the United Nations? the people who gathered together to author this charter had what causes for creating the United Nations? Okay, let's take a look at this document from another perspective, the causes for creating the United Nations. When we look at it that way, there's several answers here. We already mentioned one. The charter members of the United Nations wanted to save generations from the scourge of war. It was one of their goals to prevent further wars. That should probably sound familiar to you because you might remember from Unit 7 that there was another international organization that was created after World War I. And it was designed to prevent conflict and global problems just like World War I. It was the brainchild of President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, and it was called the League of Nations. The problem is that the League of Nations failed. And one of the reasons it failed was because the United States of America refused to join, as many members of the United States Senate believe that joining the League of Nations would actually give up American autonomy and sovereignty. However, after World War II, it was certain that such an international organization was needed in order to work to prevent such types of global warfare. It also says that the United Nations was created to reaffirm fundamental human rights, and it sets out to designate women as people who receive the same equal rights. And it sets out to say that nations, regardless of their size, these are important ideas. Remember, we learned a couple of days ago that the United Nations was responsible for the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which helped play a major role in shifting a global attitude in favor of human rights, which was a large shift from before World War II and especially before World War I. The United Nations also sought to address another problem of the League of Nations, which was that it had no ability to enforce any of its decisions. In this one, it says that they want sources of international law that can be maintained. So they're committing to creating some sort of system that will be able to enforce the policies that they decide. They want better standards of life. They want to live together in peace. They want to prevent armed forces from being used, and the social and economic advancement of all people. These are the causes stated by the charter members of the United Nations for the creation of the United Nations. So, as early as 1943, the leaders of World War II, the leaders of the winning side, the Allied powers of World War II, began to discuss the importance of creating a League of Nations-like organization that could prevent the world from falling into another type of war like World War I or World War II. In 1945, just a few months after the end of World War II, the United Nations was created by the Allied powers and approximately 49 other states around the world. When the United Nations was created, there was 51 charter member states. But at the end of 2019, there was 193 member states of the United Nations. So the United Nations exists to maintain world peace and facilitate international cooperation. That's a preemptive measure. The idea is if people are working together and learning more about one another's customs and cultures and traditions, then the differences that they have are less likely to lead to warfare. There are many different aspects to the United Nations. The primary body of the United Nations is known as the General Assembly. And the General Assembly is where all 193 members of the United Nations can sit. And they can debate policy, they can talk about problems, they give speeches, they have ambassadors, sometimes actual heads of state attend. And it's also here where oftentimes celebrities, like as seen in the picture, Beyonce with then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, celebrities will attend United Nations events in order to bring in awareness or help raise money for major United Nations causes. In this particular incident, Beyonce was there to sing her famous song, I Was Here, talking about the importance of having a legacy that gives back to people on World Humanitarian Day. Another aspect of the United Nations is the Security Council. And the Security Council is the part of the United Nations that enforces the decisions made by the General Assembly. The Security Council is only made up of 15 member states, but 10 of those member states are temporary. They rotate in and out, and they must be elected by the General Assembly. 5 of those member states are permanent. And you probably have already guessed that those 5 member states make up the 5 winners of World War II. The United States of America, the Soviet Union, or now Russia, China, Great Britain, and France. And these 5 states have a lot of power in the Security Council. As a matter of fact, anytime any one of them wants to, they can veto any policy. That's why you didn't hear a lot about the United Nations as we discussed Unit 8 and the Cold War. The ideas and concepts of the Cold War didn't often come before the United Nations because both the Soviet Union and the United States held positions in the Security Council and could easily veto at the very beginning of a discussion any concepts involving Cold War activity. The International Court of Justice is a place of enforcing international law. And while sometimes the Security Council can take action in order to enforce such laws, most members of the United Nations are willing to enforce the decisions of the International Court of Justice. The rest of these items on the list demonstrate the ideas of the United Nations is not just about preventing war. It's also about enforcing and protecting people's human rights, the idea that people have the right to life and liberty, and the idea that people don't have to be hungry. So you have the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, seeking to protect and place refugees around the world who are kicked out of their home because of political circumstances. You have the World Food Program, which seeks to feed homeless and food insecure people around the world, particularly food insecure children. UNESCO, or the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, which works to bring people together so that they'll learn about one another's cultures and customs. The United Nations Children's Fund, which seeks to protect children around the world who are living under the poverty line. And the Human Rights Watch, which seeks to make sure that people around the world, human rights are being protected. So today, I got to tell you guys, we have a short lesson. That's basically all you have to know about the United Nations. The United Nations was an international organization created in the wake of World War II in order to help prevent such global conflict from ever taking place again. So instead of debriefing today just about 9.8, let's debrief what we've learned over the last several days in Unit 9 and understanding the concept of globalization. So I'm going to give you about a minute to 90 seconds, and I want you to brainstorm responses and possibly actually write out a response to evaluate the extent to which science and technology brought change in the period from 1900 to the present. Evaluate the extent to which science and technology brought change in the period from 1900 to the present. Take about a minute to 90 seconds to look at that. Okay, I wish I had an opportunity to call on you and figure out what some of your responses are, but obviously we don't have that chance. So let me just guess a few things that you might have thought of. One thing I think you probably thought of is that that science and technology brought globalization in the period 1900 to the present. You might have thought of things like cars and airplanes and new shipping technology. You might have thought of communication technologies like the telephone, and then eventually the cell phone and the internet. All of these things help bring about globalization. You might have thought about new forms of energy, just as new forms of energy can radically change the way the world works. And in the 1900s or the 20th century, new forms of energy brought about massive amounts of consumerism and new production. You might have thought about how medicine and birth control changed the way the world worked. Or you might have thought about the Green Revolution of the 1970s and a massive effort to provide food for food insecure people. Here's the thing. All of these responses are great brainstorming, but what we haven't done yet is we haven't actually made an argument. And that's important. You have to be able to make an argument or make an actual claim responding to the prompt in order to be successful on a DBQ. For example, you have to make a claim responding to the prompt to earn the thesis point. You also have to use evidence to support a claim responding to the prompt to earn 2 of the 3 document points. And the outside evidence has to be evidence that supports a claim responding to the prompt. So once again, there's at least 5 points, not to mention the complexity point, which requires you to have a detailed or nuanced claim responding to the prompt. So you have to be able to make a claim responding to the prompt in order to be successful on the AP World History test. So that brings me to the fact that the most important word in this prompt is the word change. Now, I know a lot of you guys might have thought the most important word was evaluate, but the reality is we know exactly what to do because we have the 10-point rubric. So the word evaluate doesn't give us any new information. The word change does give us new information though. The word change tells us what our answers must show. When I make a claim responding to this prompt, I have to have a word that demonstrates change. And not just broadly, I have to give a specific change. Otherwise, I am not providing a claim responding to the prompt. So let's take our brainstorming ideas and turn them into claims responding to the prompt. Let's make some arguments. New modes of communication, as well as transportation, reduced the problem of geographic distance. If I write this sentence as my topic sentence in a paragraph, I can then go about describing planes and automobiles and cell phones and the internet and Zoom and YouTube Live and all of those things as evidence supporting this claim. But notice that it's important that there's a change word in the claim. The word reduced is an important word because that is a direct response to the prompt. Energy technologies, including the use of petroleum and nuclear power, raised productivity and increased the production of material goods. Again, change words that directly respond to the prompt. More effective forms of birth control gave women greater control over fertility and contributed to declining rates of fertility in much of the world. Again, emphasis on the change words, because in order to develop a claim responding to this prompt, my answers must contain a change. The Green Revolution in commercial agriculture increased productivity and sustained the Earth's growing population as it spread chemically and genetically modified forms of agriculture. Medical innovations, including vaccines and antibiotics, increased the ability of humans to survive and live longer lives. Okay, I'm going to give you an opportunity to make a claim, but this time I want you to use some documents. These documents are not just about the United Nations, but these documents do apply to the ideas of Unit 9 as a whole. So, use the following documents, evaluate the extent to which politics affected gender roles for women in the 20th century. Just like before, it's important for us to remember, what is the most important word in this prompt? What must your answers contain? And the answer in this case is the word affected. Your answer must contain effects. How did politics affect gender roles? Here are your documents. As usual, you'll find them in the link below, where you'll be able to use the documents in order to develop your own thesis in response to the prompt. Thank you guys so much for watching with us today. I hope you enjoyed our activities and learned a little bit about how to prepare for the AP World History test. Remember that we are now done learning new content. Tomorrow, Mr. Logereau is going to start by talking about Unit 1.1 and 1.3, South and Southeast Asia, in the global tapestry that begins in the year 1200. And I'll be back on Thursday to talk to you about Islam after the year 1200. Hope you guys have a great evening, and hope you guys have a great evening.